Well, you have to share the video once it goes live.
Yeah.
It's going to take a minute. So
I think
up.
Elliot queues them up or something on his YouTube, so I should be able to find the link before it's live.
Okay.
Have to.
I got it here. I'm just gonna.
Yep, here it is.
Okay, so.
Okay, I'm gonna share it around on Facebook now.
Yeah.
Oh, we have the Facebook stream, right? I can just share that one.
Yeah. Okay, wait. Okay, good. Cool. Okay, we got 21 people here. And thank you guys for showing up. We are here. This is Zero Books Capital Comrades special. And today we will be discussing two essays by... So this group is on Chinese Marxism. So we're going to be doing in this group the thought of Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. And I think it's interesting because not many people have really, I think in the West, not many people have really studied Chinese Marxist thought in this format, which is sort of the default format in which it's studied in China, right? In China, the three core leaders are considered to be Mao, Deng, and then Xi Jinping. So, and the function of this group, some people have criticized us, I was hilariously criticized for platforming Xi Jinping,
right.
Which is pretty good. So you realize he's the leader of like one of the most powerful countries in the world, right? I don't think he's going to get a big career boost from this. But the point is that regardless of your feelings about these things, I think it's important to study these texts in this context,
right.
and because it gives you a certain understanding of it that you wouldn't get otherwise. But obviously, from sort of an international and iconoclastic perspective, the thought of Mao Zedong, I think remains quite decisive. And today, we have a treat for you, because today we're going to be doing two essays, which I think it wouldn't be incorrect to say are really, sort of the nucleus of what we call sort of the Chinese Marxism of the core leaders, the two essays on practice and contradiction. And we're reading today from the collection by Verso on practice and contradiction. So, already telling that the collection derives its name, right, from those two essays. And I think on contradiction in particular, you could probably say that I don't think it would be controversial to suggest that's the most important essay in the history of, the reception of Marx in China, right? So that's quite and its influence is very broad, right? I mean, you can see aspects of it, in the thought of Louis Althusser or Alain Badiou. So the transmission of Maoism to the West also meant that these, and really all over the globe, I mean, we could talk about Zimbabwe, we could talk about India, we could talk about Nepal, right? But the transmission of Maoism all over the world meant these essays had a particular, or they had importance very broadly. So before we get kind of started, Ernesto, do you have any thoughts? Anything you want to say?
Well, I thought that, as you say, on practice and contradiction are one of the fundamental essays. And my impression, especially, was that they are as fundamental then as they are fundamental now. Reading on practice gave me a lot of impression about, I would say, I don't know, my past labor week. Do you know what I mean? It's very self-evidential, I guess. It's easy to apply to it's easy to apply to daily life. And I my personal favorite part, I guess, would be Mao's appeal to Marxism as the philosophy of the proletariat, right? And of Marxism as a system of education, right? And his highlighting of this in the texts, I thought, was the most important part, in the sense that it reminds us a lot about what we're doing, right? About what we're trying to do, and why we're doing this in the first place.
Well, on practice, so just to be clear, on practice is interesting because I think what Mao is really trying to do in the essay is he's trying to simultaneously develop an epistemology, but also relate that epistemology to the question of practice, right?
Right.
So, and I think it's interesting because he talks about, so the basic idea here, Mao has a very succinct, I think, formulation of this that comes at the end of the essay, right, where he says, just pull this down, he says, practice, knowledge, again practice, and again knowledge, right?
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, like, I think it's interesting because if you look, so part of his thesis is sort of that we never are capable of developing knowledge absent some kind of practical engagement in the world, right? You know, and I think he does touch on something here that's quite interesting, right? When he says, like, you know, he says something like, there's no way that the scientific knowledge of, like, European modernity could have been generated outside the context of practice. And he's talking also about production, right? So I think sometimes we have a tendency, and even if you sort of vulgarly take, you know, the distinction, like sometimes people will take the distinction of theory and practice to be completely separate terms, right? You have theory here, okay, theory, you know, and then you have practice, right? But what he's trying to do is he's trying to show how these things are connected in an immanent way, right? Which is going to be an important thing for Mao, right? Like, I think bringing these sort of, and we'll see it in the next essay too, bringing these kind of terms into a sort of rich dialectical relation. But it's, so like to try to explain, if we try to put in perspective that what he says here about practice, knowledge, again practice, and again knowledge. So his point would be that, you know, if you think of someone like Hegel, right, you have the phenomenology, right, you know, which is sort of, you know, our, you know, phenomenal experience of reality, right? Which also, right, you know, people talk about like the master-slave dialectic. This also encompasses for Hegel a certain kind of activity, right? But there's also an idealist element. Like, it's like an activity that's recapitulated within the context of phenomenal experience,
right?
You know, and again, it's not clear Mao completely departs from that, though he does have a different view for sure.
Yeah.
But like, because he says, I think at one point he says, like, it's interesting because when he talks about, he says, you know, whatever you experience in this world, you experience through like your sensuous faculties, right? So like, he's not saying like this, you know, he doesn't go to these kind of lofty ontological claims. You know, everything is being constructed immanently through experience, right?
Right.
You know, but he still will say, well, Hegel's too idealist, right? We have to, you know, I mean, I don't think Mao is a Hegel scholar, so maybe we don't need to get into that too much. But
yeah.
So again, if we look at this formulation, right, practice, knowledge, again practice, and again knowledge. So the basic idea here is all knowledge is necessarily acquired through practice, right? But like, if you think of what, I think a good way to think of this is if you think of like what science is, right? Like, science is based on a certain, like, if something happens so many times, right, you know, then you can say that it's inductively valid, right?
Yeah.
Well, Hume raised the problem with this, right? Like, what you know, what does it mean? Like how does that mean something's true, right? Just because it repeats a bunch of times, right? Well, Mao isn't so interested here with like totally abstract conceptions of truth, right? That's not what he's concerned with. What he's concerned with is you practice. That's how you experience the world. You only get the world through your sort of sensuous faculties, right? You know, and we're going to take this. We'll talk about politics in a sec. But you do things, right? Then you observe that there are, you know, let's say inductive patterns, right? Tendencies which arise, right? You know, based on this practice, right? Then that becomes knowledge, right? Yes. And then that knowledge allows you to restructure and remotivate your practice, right? And then you have to test that. So it's a series of kind of experimental hypotheses that are being tested, right? And I think actually comparing it, there is, you know, you can talk about Mao and Althusser. I mean, there is like kind of a scientific aspect, you know, to the way Mao sort of puts this forth. So you know, so it's like you have to, if you think of something like, you know, Marxism, I would argue, if you look at the ideas of Marx, these are already, it's already a form of knowledge that derives from practical experience, right? So in other words, like if we talk about the relationship between the private ownership of the means of production and the social relations of production, right, which are characteristic of capitalism, like, everyone in the factory together, okay, talking kind of about Marx this time, more complicated today, but okay, if we talk about that, right, well, not more complicated maybe in China, but you get my point. Okay, but if we talk about that, Marx was already, inscribing knowledge that he was able to observe because of his point in history, right? So it's like there had already been factory struggles, there had already been unions, right? So Marx didn't just come along, like Marx wasn't just like, that's how, I just a priori deduced without any knowledge, without any practical experience, how, the value form is going to work out, for example. And that's not what he did, right? What he did was he came along and he was part of a certain conjuncture, right? And coming from that conjuncture, he was able to take these, different instances of activism, and he was able to situate them in relation to what Mao will describe in the next essay as the primary contradiction, right? But in other words, he was able to take these sort of activistic, instances and relate them to the larger social field and create a more scientific account of the social field, right? Based on that. But then also, right, so this is, right, this is sort of knowledge, right? So this kind of functions as a logic, right? Capital is the logic of capital, right? It's not just the phenomenal experience of capital, it's the logic of capital, right? But then Marxism also has to be tested, right? At the level of practice. Because Marxism isn't just saying, get better wages for the workers.
Yeah.
Right? That's not what it's saying, right? Which is what a lot of stuff said before that, right? There was also more totalistic visions, but they weren't so scientific. What Marxism is saying is the workers have to control the means of production. And not only do the workers have to control the means of production, but that, it is the imminent outcome of the contradictions of capitalism that the workers will control the means of production, right? But then that has to be tested, right? Because Marx just gives us another form of knowledge, right? Which then has to be applied in practice. Then you have to create more knowledge, right? So if Lenin writes about this, right? Lenin is trying to apply that, right? The knowledge of Marx, and then he's reinscribing his own practice at the level of knowledge based on the observation of patterns, based on the calcifying of that into a logic. Right?
Right.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. I just want to put up a quote so we can read it. That's okay with you? Just
sure.
The computer's freezing up a little bit. Yeah, I'll just read it. I can't put it up. I can put it in the private chat, right? And then you can.
Yeah, you can type it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So Mao says Marxism could be the product only of capitalist society. Marx, in the era of laissez-faire capitalism, could not concretely know certain laws peculiar to the era of imperialism beforehand, because imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, had not yet emerged, and the relevant practice was lacking. Only Lenin and Stalin could undertake this task. Then he says, leaving aside their genius, the reason why Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin could work out their theories was mainly that they personally took part in the practice of the class struggle and the scientific experimentation of their time. Lacking this condition, no genius could have succeeded. Right?
Yeah. So if you look at sort of Lenin's analysis of like the way that the way that an incapacity to generate profits, right, manifests in like the monopolization of markets by firms that are then kind of internationalized and seek foreign markets and this kind of thing. We can go on. This is a case of, these people observing, and again, I think it'll help when we get to the next essay in explaining some of the content of this essay, but these people observing secondary contradictions which emerge within, the basic contradiction, which is character of capital, or which is character of capital, right? So, you have to, you have to be in those situations in order to be able to do that, right? As for the thing about Ender Wiggin brings up, I realized that you couldn't quote the part of the essay where Mao calls Stalin a genius because
we just did.
Yeah, we just did. But do you have that? Do you have that there? Yeah.
Yeah, he says. I mean, he calls them geniuses. He says, leaving aside their genius, the reason why Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin could work out the theories was mainly that they personally took part in the practice of the class struggle and the scientific experimentation of their time. Lacking this condition, no genius could have succeeded, right?
Yeah.
So he's calling him a genius, but he's saying that the first and foremost thing about this genius was that he was on the front lines of the class struggle, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like if you look at I mean, again, I think if you want to understand Mao's trajectory, one thing you have to understand is that like what I think can properly be called like high Maoism was constructed over time, right? So I think, if you look at the early stages of, when they were sort of in Yunnan, right, prior to the Communist Party taking power, Mao was mostly quite content to present himself as being like, sort of, junior to the Soviet Union and to Stalin. And Stalin had played an important role in kind of mentoring him. And, Stalin had been a fan of Mao, so to speak, right? He had because I think what Stalin appreciated in Mao was that Mao was someone who was capable of developing a more unique understanding of strategic conditions in China.
Right.
So, it attests to sort of maybe the versatility of Stalin as a strategist or a thinker, that he was able to see that. But, when Mao when Stalin is denounced, right, by Khrushchev, right, in the early 60s, right, in the Soviet Union, I think Mao, on one hand, it kind of emboldens him to be more critical of Stalin in certain ways. And I think on the other hand, it causes him to want to position himself as senior to like Khrushchev and to the Soviet bureaucracy that had sort of taken over in the wake of Stalin, right? So I think when you look at these essays, now these essays are from the 1930s, right? And it's very interesting, right? Like I think, so this on contradiction, for example, was supposedly given at like a military as like a course he did, and then it was later included in selected works. And it's interesting because the formulation of these that we have today from the selected works, they come from they were, I think, transcribed by Chenoboda, who was an ancient history professor, and so there's probably a little bit of like editing and ghostwriting going on, like, and I think it would be silly to think that Mao just conceived of these ideas in like a vacuum, and wasn't actively drawing on the expertise, because Mao wasn't like a, perceptions. It's hard to know so much about Mao, maybe because so much has been said and written and much of it's contradictory. I think, in China, if you look at the situation, there were certain like left-wing intellectuals, right? Before Mao, but I think Mao's real break was to come along and be the one who was like, we need to organize a party, we need to do this. Well, it was sort of already there, but to really try to create like a strong military organization, right? And he hadn't traveled abroad like other people. He hadn't went to like, Paris and done this like, kind of international, student apprenticeship.
Right.
So there was a certain, he was from the peasant class, right? Upper peasant. So I don't think he had these sort of like, from the get-go, I should say, I don't think he had these sort of like lofty intellectual bona fides, but I think he was very, very intelligent and very, sponge-like, absorbing everything in his environment, right? So even when you look at these texts, it's obviously he's drawing in sort of from whatever's kind of around him too, translations of Marx that are available, works by Lenin, and this sort of thing. Right? The difference, so Melanie Day says, the difference between theory and practice is Mao's rhetoric and the ultimate result of let 100 flowers bloom. Okay, I don't know if I totally get that. I need a little bit more context for that comment. But I just want to draw in here a little bit. So we have the part where he talks about, let me just zoom in a paragraph here. So I'm going to copy a paragraph and read it.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see.
Oof, that's
I know it was just copied out a bunch of times. Okay, so as social practice continues, things that give rise to man's sense perceptions and impressions in the course of his practice are repeated many times. Then a sudden leap takes place in the brain in the process of cognition, and concepts are formed. Concepts are no longer the phenomena, the separate aspects, and the external relations of things. They grasp the essence, the totality, and the internal relations of things. Between concepts and sense perceptions, there is not only a quantitative, but also a qualitative difference. Proceeding further, by means of judgment and inference, one is able to draw logical conclusions. The expression in Sun Kao Yan Yi, knit the brows and a stratagem comes to mind, or in everyday language, let me think it over, refers to man's use of concepts in the brain to form judgments and inferences. This is the second stage of cognition. When the members of the observation group have collected various data, and what is more, have thought them over, they're able to arrive at the judgment that the Communist Party's policy of the National United Front against Japan is thorough, sincere, and genuine. Having made this judgment, they can, if they too are genuine about uniting to save the nation, go a step further and draw the following conclusion. The National United Front against Japan can succeed. The stage of conception, judgment, and inference is the more important stage in the entire process of knowing a thing. It is the stage of rational knowledge. The real task of knowing is, through perception, to arrive at thought, to arrive step by step at the comprehension of the internal contradictions of objective things, of their laws, and the internal relations between one process and another. That is, to arrive at logical knowledge. To repeat, logical knowledge differs from perceptual knowledge, and the perceptual knowledge pertains to the separate aspects, the phenomena, and the external relations of things, whereas logical knowledge takes a big stride forward to reach the totality, the essence and the internal relations of things, and discloses the inner contradictions in the surrounding world. Therefore, logical knowledge is capable of grasping the development of the surrounding world in its totality and the internal relation of all its aspects. So again, here we see a little bit, perhaps like an influence from impressionism. Or sorry, not impressionism, sorry, empiricism to some extent.
right. Yeah.
Definitely. But I think what kind of interests me about this this passage is the way, again, if you want to kind of allegorize it a little bit to dialectic, I think one thing you can kind of think about is like, if you think of the development of mathematics as like a self-subsistent kind of structure, right? So it's like, if you look at like in ancient Egypt, they had like rope measuring, for example. They had this ability to they had a sort of provisional mathematics, right? But they hadn't sort of raised mathematics to the level of a logic, which is a self-subsistent structure, right? That indexes to, I think Mao says here, let's see here,
He actually goes into that a little bit, into the historical aspect in the next essay. So we can cover that when we get there too.
Yeah, that would be good too. And I just want to, and he refers here, so you definitely see the empiricist aspect, right? Because when he talks about the perceptual stage of cognition as opposed to sort of the logical stage of cognition, he refers to it as the stage of sense perceptions and impressions. That is, the particular things in Yinan act on the sense organs of the members of the observation group, evoke sense perceptions, and give rise in their brain to many impressions, together with a rough sketch of the external relations among these impressions. And you have the difference between internal and external, and that's very significant, right?
He does criticize empiricism, though.
Yeah,
little
well,
bit.
he says he has the thing on empiricism and rationalism, right? He
Mhm.
says, um,
You want me to read it?
yeah, sure, you read it. Yeah.
He says, to think that knowledge can stop at the lower perceptual stage and that perceptual knowledge alone is reliable, while rational knowledge is not, would be to repeat the historical error of empiricism. This theory errs in failing to understand that although the data of perception reflects certain realities in the objective world, I'm not speaking here of idealist empiricism, which confines experience to so-called introspection, they are merely one-sided and superficial, reflecting things incompletely and not reflecting their essence.
Yeah. So this is I think this is like quite because if you look at what Kant, right, is trying to sort of accomplish, what Kant kind of says is, well, you can't, the structure of things, you have to understand it's not enough just to have, kind of impressions or ideas. You have to look at the actual transcendental logic that governs, how we perceive those things, right? So what is sort of the underlying logic that governs our experience, right? And we could talk about kind of the pure categories of the understanding and stuff like this, right? But for Hegel, this is sort of the transcendental logic. It's not just fixed, right? It sort of evolves over time, right? And it's subject to change, right? So I think if you look at what Mao is kind of saying here when he talks about empiricism and rationalism, what he's saying is that, because you could say that in a sense, like it's often said that Kant's work represents a sort of synthesis of empiricism and rationalism, right? To the extent that he circumscribes the, it's the critique of pure reason, right? Like how at what point can reason function of its own in its own way by itself, and at what point does it require, sort of empirical observation as a kind of crux, right? Or that has to delimit what it's capable of achieving. And I think if you look at what Mao is trying to get at here, right, what he's saying is like that, well, what we could call rationalism, right, in a way it supervenes when someone understands the internal structure of the object, right? Because then you're able to actually, apply reason, right, in that way, right? So he portrays it, I think, as more phasical, if that makes sense. We progress from like an empirical understanding of something to a rational understanding of something, right, based on the mapping of its internal relations, right, which are at first experienced in this way that is quite vague.
Yeah. I think a very vulgar example of this working out, I would say, I don't know, getting to understand how a video game works, right? Like, I don't know, any fighting game on a first impression, has a certain quality to its physics that makes it feel like it mimics the real world, right?
Yeah.
But when you break it down, when you understand its internal workings, you can, I don't know, wave dash, for example. Right?
Yeah. It's like, and then you understand, like, it's not like you're just taking other aspects of what you know and projecting it onto, like, the canvas of whatever you're seeing. You're actually understanding the internal logic of how that thing functions.
Right. And working through that logic.
Yeah, and he says to reflect a thing in its totality, to reflect its essence, to reflect its inherent laws, it is necessary through the exercise of thought to reconstruct the rich data of sense perception, discarding the dross and selecting the essential, eliminating the false and retaining the true, proceeding from the one to the other and from the outside to the inside. Right, so we kind of get in the rational, like, you need this preliminary state, right? And actually, Matthew Valdez says this sounds like a summary of the first part of the phenomenology of spirit. Yeah, I mean, like, obviously Mao influenced by dialectics, right? But you need to have this kind of first stage, right, of this kind of more superficial phenomenal understanding of the thing before you're able to actually do justice to it itself. So in the science of logic, for example, Hegel talks about how, the quality of water, or Aristotle will say, like, the quality of water is its wetness, and Hegel's like, well, this isn't really, like a real internal understanding of the thing. Right. And the internal understanding of the thing, right, he talks about chemism, right, when you actually start to get into like chemical properties and kind of break things down, right, then you're actually getting more toward, right, the internal kind of logical structure of the thing. But in a way, this is a kind of never-ending process also, which I think is also clarified in the next essay. But I just want to say that, so again, I think you have this, I think it's safe to say that this is, that what we see in On Practice is a sort of, let's say, simplification of the presentation of dialectical methodology, but with a strong tilt toward, like a strong stress on the necessarily practical character, of the engagement that one has with the world. And people have varying accounts of Hegel in terms of how present that is within Hegel. Right. Good? Yeah? Everybody, any questions? Yeah. Everybody good? Cool. Anything you want to say about that, Ernesto?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay, cool. Let's move on. So now we are at the August 1937. We are at On Contradiction. On Contradiction, and this is, oh man, you guys are luckier here. This is a good one, On Contradiction. So On Contradiction deals with, yes, contradiction, and I think just to give a little bit of a gloss on it, maybe. There's a lot there, right? It's quite a long essay, but I'm going to try to give a bit of a gloss on it. I mean, let's stick at the end, because Mao has his own gloss, and I think I want to if we go to the end of the essay, I want to copy what Mao actually said about it. Maybe we can read that, and then we can run off that summary. Okay. So,
you mean like
the conclusion? Just
conclusion. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to copy in the conclusion. Someone said something. Wait, let's see here. Justin Murphy would say that Mao wasn't trying to achieve real communism. I'm sure he would. So here, I'm going to read the conclusion. So this is functions as a summary of On Contradiction. We may now say a few words to sum up. The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the fundamental law of nature and of society, and therefore also the fundamental law of thought. So Mao talks about this, how for things to have a fundamental relationship that permits their co-constitutive change, they have to be united, right, in such a way that change in one thing can ignite change in the other. Right. So he says, if you boil an egg, it changes, but if you boil, but you can't do the same thing to a rock.
Right.
So it's like this already implies a sort of elemental relationship, right, between the things. It stands opposed to a metaphysical world outlook. It represents a great revolution in the history of human knowledge. According to dialectical materialism, contradiction is present in all processes of objectively existing things and of subjective thought, and permeates all these processes from beginning to end. This is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. Each contradiction and each of its aspects have their respective characteristics. This is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. In given conditions, opposites possess identity, and consequently can coexist in a single entity and can transform themselves into each other. This again is the particularity and relativity of contradiction. But the struggle of opposites is ceaseless. It goes on both when the opposites are coexisting and when they are transforming themselves into each other, and becomes especially conspicuous when they are transforming themselves into one another. This again is the universality and absoluteness of contradiction. In studying the particularity and relativity of contradiction, we must give attention to the distinction between the principal contradiction and the non-principal contradiction, and to the distinction between the principal and the non-principal aspect of a contradiction. In studying the universality of contradiction and the struggle of opposites in contradiction, we must give attention to the distinction between the different forms of struggle. Otherwise, we shall make mistakes. If through study we achieve a real understanding of the essentials explained above, we shall be able to demolish dogmatist ideas which are contrary to the basic principles of Marxism-Leninism and detrimental to our revolutionary cause, and our comrades with practical experience will be able to organize their experience into principles and avoid repeating empiricist errors. There are a few simple conclusions. These are a few simple conclusions from our study of the law of contradiction. So I want to say, first of all, I think what's most interesting about this essay is just the idea of primary and secondary contradictions, and also, and you have to differentiate between that. And principal contradiction and not the principal contradiction, right? Which is a really interesting kind of tension, right? So let's see here. So he talks about, so the basic idea here would be that, like, if you have, I think he says at one point that the primary contradiction, right, is the contradiction between bourgeois and proletariat, right?
Right.
But he says what you're going to see is you're going to have all these like secondary contradictions, like imperialism, right, is a secondary contradiction, right? You know, the anti-colonial struggle is a secondary contradiction, right? You know, feminism is a secondary contradiction, these kind of things, right? He doesn't say feminism, but you know, I can ad lib it. I think we can deduce that. So, but what's interesting about his view is that he, and I think this is what makes the essay most interesting, is that Mao, he doesn't say like, oh, well, just pursue the primary contradiction. Of course you pursue the primary contradiction, right? But what he says is then you have the principal contradiction. And the principal contradiction is not necessarily the primary contradiction, right? Because the principal contradiction, right, that's like, that can be a contradiction that's imminent to your situation, right? So I think he says at one point that in China, like our principal contradiction is like the you know, anti-imperialist struggle. Yeah. Right. That's like the principal contradiction in China. So very interesting, right? Because he's willing even to subordinate the question of the class struggle at that moment, which is, you know, the late 1930s, right? You know, so obviously, you know, the Japanese have invaded China, you know, right? That's 37, yeah. And you know, you have this fighting between the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party, and there were a number of other imperial powers who were like paying off warlords and want to cut China in different pieces to make it more exploitable and this kind of thing. So he's like, this is our principal contradiction, is dealing with this, right? And I think, you know, I think this is really, really important because I see, because this is, for me, why this essay, you know, I think if you talk to me about like on practice, it's like, I think it's an interesting essay. What does it tell us for today? Some things for sure. But I think on contradiction is a more interesting essay for today. And I think the reason for that is because Marxism has been, there is like a new, you know, one thing that was very, very common, you know, in the, let's say the wake of the collapse of actually existing socialism and kind of the recomposition of the left, is this tendency to be like, you know, we just need to focus unrelentingly on the primary contradiction, right? The problem was they didn't focus on the primary contradiction. You know, so people will say this, like, they'll be like, oh, well, you know, if you're interested, you know, or if you offer even like equivocal support for China, or if you're interested, you know, in their struggle in terms of, you know, preventing kind of like, you know, foreign acquisition of their economy in the form of rents or something, they'd be like, well, that's kind of nonsense, right? That's just like, you know, bullshit, right? You know, this is not, you know, the primary contradiction, which is class struggle. I agree with you, right? Class struggle is the primary contradiction, right? But the thing is, that's not necessarily the principal contradiction within a given situation, right? Right. You know, and that's the thing you got to remember. And I think also, so I want to highlight, you know, on one hand you have that, right? On the other hand, you have the fact that, you know, one thing you have, like, if you look at someone like Moïse Poston, right, sort of like value analytic theoretical readings of Marx, he'll say like, you know, well, you know, the intrinsic, you know, the intrinsic contradiction of capitalism is in the form of value, and, you know, class and property relations are in a sense extrinsic to this, right? Like, and it's like, well, first of all, I don't know what intrinsic and extrinsic means. I mean, I'm pretty sure like class relations are very central, you know, to the contradiction of value itself, right? So I'm not sure what this is supposed to achieve. But also it's like, you know, he'll kind of make these gestures where he's like, oh, well, you know, the proletarian struggle, you know, is just kind of like the reification of the proletariat as an actor that, you know, doesn't bear upon the work, like capital's working out of its own contradictions. Well, first of all, what does that even mean? Working out of its own contradictions? Like, what the hell does that even mean? Right. And second
He's
of all,
not wrong. He's not wrong. But the point is that it's working out its secondary contradictions, to use Mao's terminology, right?
well, I mean, again, I don't want to say that the struggle between bourgeois and proletariat is a secondary contradiction. For Mao, it's a primary contradiction. But I think the point is that there's a whole ignoral of the way that secondary contradictions relate to primary contradictions.
Yeah.
Right. So wherever you identify the primary contradiction, whether you identify it in some abstract mechanism of value, whether you identify it in class struggle, right, wherever you identify it, you have to acknowledge that there's going to be secondary contradictions that affect that. Right. So, and this, if we're talking about value, right, this is like very, very significant, because if you look at like the women's struggle, for example, well, it's like, the fact that you have women in the home who are not, let's say, waged, right, who are performing, I guess, what is often called like socially reproductive labor or whatever, right, activities that are not directly market mediated, right? In any case, this is like absolutely central to the reproduction of capital, right? Now, is it the primary contradiction? Maybe not, right? But then the struggle, right, in that area has a great bearing on these other things,
right?
When a country becomes communist, when it resists, when it resists foreign imperialism, right, this also makes it harder for firms to have access to cheap labor, which in turn puts pressure on the rate of profit, right? It drives the rate of profit down. When a union unionizes its workers, when it gets a higher wage raise, right, this also can depreciate the rate of profit, right? So this is what I mean. You have to look at all these things, and you can't just say, oh, that's not the primary contradiction. And that's the problem today. For me, that's the number one problem we have. In many ways, it's the number one problem in the left, is that people don't see the difference now between a lot of people don't see the difference between primary and secondary contradictions, right? It's like, and I think we were talking about this with money. So I was attributing the entire, if you could kind of read into it, we were talking about the Khmer Rouge.
Right. Yeah.
Sort of the catastrophe of the Khmer Rouge, which is also sponsored by China. And I think by Mao and Deng, by the way. I think if you look at the Khmer Rouge, I think we're the only communist regime in history to abolish money, which I find hilarious. I have to tell you, the Khmer Rouge are the ultimate ultra-left regime. But
they got out of their armchairs.
Yeah, they got out of their armchairs. They went out and changed the world. But I think if you look at so you think about this like abolishing money, it's like if you look at something like abolishing money, it's like but that may pertain to the primary contradiction, right? Very intimately, right? Because money is what allows the value form to function, right? In terms of capital self-valorization. Right, production of surplus value, right, class inequality, all of this, right? So money is very, very central to that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it's the principal contradiction,
right?
Because it's like that's something you got to get toward.
Yeah,
it's something you got to work toward. But if it's not the principal contradiction, you got to address the principal contradiction, right? Then you have to, you'll get to a moment, right, when that becomes the principal contradiction.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm saying, because we were having this discussion, and some people were saying, well, the Khmer Rouge are not communists. No, to me, they're communists. They just didn't understand the principal contradiction. But this shows you how that's not a light matter, right? What Khmer Rouge killed millions of people, right? That's not a light matter, right? Because if you, let's say, like, for example, if you say, well, we're just going to deal with the primary contradiction right now, we're not going to look at what the principal contradiction is. Right, you can see how that could lead to a mentality where it's like, let's just liquidate, anything that's not, it's like, as someone joked in our group, right? You can't, you can't be capitalist if you're dead.
Yeah.
So, but is that a good way of achieving those things in the long run? Is that something that's going to create like a real, as Zizek talks about, in the foreword for this book, he talks about a kind of institutional. Like the incapacity of Maoism to generate like an institutional synthesis, right? And I think, again, with the Khmer Rouge, we have to look at, I would argue that if Mao made mistakes, it was because he failed to follow his own advice.
Sure.
Right. But just because he writes this doesn't mean he's always going to do it perfectly in practice.
Yeah.
Right. he identified the process, right? Did he do it? Conrad, would you say that the Khmer Rouge didn't deal with the principal contradiction, but Ho Chi Minh did? Yes.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah, I think he was better at it. I think at some point the principal contradiction for Ho Chi Minh became getting rid of the Khmer Rouge because they didn't understand.
Yeah, they focused on the nationalist, anti-imperialist. So so that's smart. I want to rescue something from the previous essay. Bring something back. Around the end, Mao goes into a little bit of what we're talking about. Having the wrong mentality. In this case, since he's not explicitly talking about contradiction, he talks about, just empiricist kind of appeals, right? So I'm going to read it. He says, it often happens, however, that thinking lags behind reality. This is because man's cognition is limited by numerous social conditions. We are opposed to diehards in the revolutionary ranks whose thinking fails to advance with changing objective circumstances and has manifested itself historically as right opportunism. These people fail to see that the struggle of opposites has already pushed the objective process forward while their knowledge has stopped at the old stage. This characteristic of the thinking of all diehards. Their thinking is divorced from social practice, and they cannot march ahead to guide the chariot of society. They simply trail behind, grumbling that it goes too fast and trying to drag it back or turn it in the opposite direction. Right? So a little bit of what we're talking about. It's not specifically, distinction between contradictions, but it's talking about focusing on the wrong problem, right? Having an outlook of reality that doesn't match the actual social circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting here too because he also compares this with like more traditional forms of Chinese thought. So he talks about the identity of opposites, right? So the real and concrete opposites and the real and concrete transformation of opposites into one another. And he says there are numeral transformations in mythology, and I like how he cites the Monkey King's 72 metamorphoses. And because that would be a good shout out to you Dragon Ball fans. Because that's Goku's transformation. John, what he's talking about, the Monkey King, he's like Goku. It's Chinese mythology. It's a book, Journey to the West, and it inspired Dragon Ball. So when he talks about the Monkey King's 72 metamorphoses, I think Goku had maybe 4, but whatever.
A couple of fusions, so on and so forth.
I don't have a list in front of me, unfortunately. But what he says here is that these are sort of mythical. He says these are like mythical transformations that don't actually show the way that something convenes with its opposite.
Yeah, he says they are not concrete changes reflecting concrete contradictions. They are naive, imaginary, subjectively conceived transformations conjured up in men's minds by innumerable real and complex transformations of opposites into one another.
Yeah, and he also criticizes the notion of complementarity. So this kind of yin yang, kind of like you need this, and he's saying the problem with this is it doesn't give us like an actual motor for understanding change, right? Because it's kind of, and this actually was my criticism of. It's related, right? But like I wrote an essay criticizing Nina Powers, sort of critique of, transgender kind of politics, right? And Nina Power was sort of like, well, we have a sex is like a transcendental condition of thought, and she's kind of basing this in like a little bit like the Marxist distinction between like production and social reproduction, like whether you have, children or not, right? And ultimately like her thought gestates towards this kind of very Forbackian like notion of complementarity. So for Forbach, right, you have like essence and existence being in a kind of complementary state, right? So it's like, like the idea is like, what we project onto God, right? These sort of values are like, there's a complementarity, because that is in a way, it's like a higher expression of just what man is, right? It's like already there, right? Man and woman, right? Essence and existence. It's like a complementarity. And, Mao was criticizing this because you see the kind of essentializations it leads to, right? Man and woman, complementary, right? Trans-historical, the logic of complementarity, right? It's like, but what about not either? Right?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to wade into like particularly, spicy debates. But I'm just saying, I think we have to acknowledge in any area of inquiry, right? We have to acknowledge the possibility for that kind of qualitative transformation, which is like very much, what Mao, is trying to get at, right? In this. Another thing, by the way, that we should really, really stress here, and I think this is, very important. So at one point he says something very interesting here about the superstructure that is like, yeah, so yeah, we have to copy a paragraph here. I'm just gonna throw it out. So some people think that this is, so he says, in the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the productive forces are the principal aspect. In the contradiction between theory and practice, practice is the principal aspect. In the contradiction between the economic base and the superstructure, the economic base is the principal aspect. And there is no, so what he's saying is that some people think there can be no change in these positions, right? So he says productive forces are always more important, are always principal with respect to relations of production. Practice is always more, principal when compared to theory. Economic base always over superstructure, and so on. So he says this is a mechanical materialist conception, not the dialectical materialist conception. True, the productive forces, practice, and the economic base generally play the principal and decisive role. Whoever denies this is not a materialist. But it must also be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and the superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. When it is impossible for the productive forces to develop without a change in the relations of production, then the change in the relations of production plays the principal and decisive role. The creation and advocacy of revolutionary theory plays the principal and decisive role in those times of which Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. When a task, no matter which, has to be performed, but there is as yet no guiding line, method, plan, or policy, the principal and decisive thing to decide on is a guiding line, method, plan, or policy. When the superstructure obstructs the development of the economic base, political and cultural changes become principal and decisive. Are we going against materialism when we say this? No. The reason is that while we recognize that in the general development of history, the material determines the mental, and social being determines social consciousness, we also, and indeed must, recognize the reaction of mental on material things, of social consciousness on social being, and of the superstructure on the economic base. This does not go against materialism. On the contrary, it avoids mechanical materialism and firmly upholds dialectical materialism. Okay, so this is like pretty intense.
Yeah.
So what Mao is saying here is that there are times when the principal contradiction isn't even the materialist contradiction.
Yeah.
Right? That's crazy. But again, like it also shows you, like, if you think of someone like Louis Althusser, right, who was undoubtedly influenced by Mao, right? When Althusser says, like, there's a principle of economic determination in the last instance, right? What he means, right, similarly, and I think you can discern a Maoist influence here, is that won't necessarily play the decisive role in any given instance, right? Of course, we should say that Althusser has a more elaborate understanding of ideology than Mao does, to the extent that Althusser actually, and when he talks about sort of ideological state apparatuses and things like that, he actually relates ideology to the production of material, and like, what is material? This is a big philosophic thing, but he relates it to like a school, for example, is a material structure, right? Also instills ideology. So Althusser is kind of in there navigating like the nitty gritty of those contradictions. But yeah, it's important, and I think, I think you have to say one thing. I think that you have to say is, like, if you think of, it was very common in the sort of like what we talk about, like Western Marxism for a long time, to talk about, ideology, right? But then if you look at those societies, right, like if you look at like kind of like your Fordist kind of New Deal sort of society, right, there was after World War II and so on, like there was a lot of, like 90% tax rates for like the upper strata, and you can see why, in a way, that ideology became very galvanizing in this context, because it's like, well, we've already achieved these things, right? Like economic conditions themselves aren't pushing people towards a form of desperation that's eligible to engender this sort of revolutionary change, right? So what we need is a focus on sort of the ideological structure, right? And then there were other things that did motivate people, right? Like people in America not wanting to be conscripted and go to fight in the Vietnam War, for example, even though economic conditions were relatively favorable to the working class. But I think so again, it speaks to, I think, a lot of the innovations that are generated within Western Marxism in that period, and it's no surprise that you see Mao lurking under the surface here, right? Are related to this notion of the way that ideological and theoretical problems become sort of principal contradictions. But I think if you look at neoliberalism, right, from 1980, right, I think what we're seeing now is, if you look at the increasing rift between rich and poor, the way that this led to the 07-08 crisis, right? Because the idea was like, oh, well, we don't want to redistribute wealth, so we'll just use to fix the demand problem. We'll do two things. We'll just get all our goods made in China to drive down the price of goods, and we'll use credit. Well, credit blew up with the subprime crisis. Yeah. Right. And using China to make goods made China into a world power. So no free lunch, no such thing as a free lunch, right? I'm not saying it's bad, right? But this is the consequence for America.
It's also helping Mexico. The NAFTA also pushed a lot of the working class south of the border, and now it's helping us.
Yeah, and of course, you can debate about, obviously that's not all good, right? You had good jobs,
right?
Lost being replaced.
Yeah, it's not the kind of jobs you want.
Yeah, but in Mexico, nevertheless, it enlarges the productive apparatuses, right?
Which is
the means of production, so to speak, can be enabled by that. But what I mean here is, it's like, but if you look at, so this kind of, you have the 2007-08 crisis, right? And I think really since the 2007-08 crisis, I think the shift has been that the principal contradiction has been, again, like an economic contradiction.
Right.
Right. In the sense that you see these, and you see this is like what's driving people, towards these, look at this very volatile climate in the United States with like Capitol Hill. Well, okay, those people don't have like a Marxist reading of what's going on, right? But I think it's the same contradiction, right? Manifested, right, in a way that's ideological, that's driving people that way. But I think the principal contradiction is the economic contradiction.
I mean, I think if you want even more evidence that it's an economic contradiction, just look at the GameStop thing that happened last week. Right?
Yeah. Well, and it shows you like that really showed like the level of anger, right?
Right.
Now towards stockbrokers and people working in finance markets and things like this. So and again, I think looking at so I want to, and with COVID, obviously this has reached a really reached a very dramatic level. But I think also it's important to understand like how how this sort of, how Chinese leadership can be understood in relation to this evaluation of the principal contradiction, as opposed to the primary contradiction, right? Because I think that what's very clear, right? Like, we're going to get into this eventually, but I think what's very clear when you read, so Mao was like, we're going to be a big player. He sent off foreign aid to Albania and other countries even when they didn't have enough rice to feed their own people. There were these very, very transformative cultural campaigns like the Cultural Revolution. I think if you look at what Deng does, Deng's sort of like, well, no, the principal contradiction, means of production, right?
Yeah. Can you highlight a comment that Ender just made? I just want to address it. Yeah.
This? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. He says, the problem is that in Mexico, we don't have a centrally planned economy and the Communist Party dictating policy. Yeah, you're right. I see, ups and downs. On the one hand, China is famous for its policy being, very endangering to the well-being of the workers in the factories, right? I can tell you that the regulations here in Mexico are much more severe than, they are pragmatic, precisely. Yeah. So on the one hand, you have regulations here, right? And on China, you also have regulations, right? But it's it's more pragmatic. But on the other hand, there is not enough government employees to enforce regulations in the first place. So even if we have on paper, right, the idea of good work, right, of safe work, that's not the case. That's not the actual case in practice. So, and one of the bigger problems is that the capital that is raised here in Mexico, when it comes to become a certain volume of capital, it flees the country, because of course it's profitable to invest in labor, right, in the third world, but where it's more profitable to invest in real estate is not in the third world, right?
Yeah,
So,
which is also, you could, it shows that there aren't strong capital controls, right? The companies can just do that. And that's the whole issue, right? It's like, we've already talked about this, like, it seems like in Mexico, it's too much of like a buffet à volonté, for sort of like a capital, right? Because leave the country as it wants. It can, there isn't strict controls to make sure that, you have the continuity of domestic ownership. You don't necessarily have investments being made in infrastructure that are going to, like, aid the public and capital accumulation in any case, which also implies taxation, right? So I think China's success has been through the use of this sort of centralized model, right, which was bestowed to them, from the communist era, to negotiate these questions. But I'm just saying, whether one agrees with say Deng or not, and China, I wouldn't characterize China as like simply Dengist today, but whether one agrees with Deng or not, I think that you have to understand how he intervenes, right, into that discussion, and it's a relocation of the principal contradiction. I mean, the principal contradiction in the Cultural Revolution was treated at the level, I'm going to say, of, not that there weren't economic things done, but it was treated at the level of culture and ideology, I think, right? The way like reactionary thinking, as well as like a penchant for like Soviet-style bureaucratization, was holding China back, right, from a more authentic realization of communism, right? I think, in for Deng, and Deng has sort of this accelerationist kind of, sort of like a fully automated luxury communist sort of aspect. I think when Deng's vision of communism was like, everyone, being able to have, a relative abundance of material goods, everything need to live, schools, infrastructure, material possessions, whatever, right? I think this was sort of his vision of it. But I think his idea was that, we have to develop the means of production to even get to the point where their re-socialization, so to speak, can be truly productive for the entire population.
Yeah.
Right. So again, but I think also, so this is important to stress, right? I think that if you look at the strength of, the strength that's been obtained by the Chinese state, I think a lot of it owes to the way that Maoism gives the state a kind of, and I don't want to resort to like itself like a very idealist way of understanding. There's lots of material aspects, but on the level of theory and on the level of ideology, right, I think they have a strong advantage in this, because Mao talks about a guiding plan, right, in the sense that they have a guiding plan that is rigorously materialist, that distills from some of the richest aspects of Marxist-Leninist thought and refines them, but also there's a certain level of flexibility.
Yeah.
Right. And I think being able to talk about primary and secondary contradictions and principal and non-principal contradictions is absolutely essential to that. And that's why I think, this may be, the central text of Maoism. And I think we could go further and say, of Chinese Marxism tout court. Right. So I think when we go forward and when we examine, work by, Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping, I think it's going to be very, very interesting and important to try to relate it back to this essay and see how they're attempting to redefine Marxism or Maoism, as the case may be, in relation to what Mao, the gesture that he accomplishes there, right? And this is actually something, like love him or hate him, right? This is something that Deng said. He said to repeat Maoism, verbatim would not be Maoism.
Precisely. I mean, that's Mao's point regarding Marxism.
Yeah. That you're going to be in a different situation, right? So it's funny, again, people sometimes attack these people as pure vulgarizers. I'm not here to say that they're perfect or anything like that, But I'm just saying, I think this is why it's important for us to read through these texts and analyze them in their own terms, the way people do in, the same kind of canon that people do in China, right? To try to get an overview of that and to understand it in its depth rather than just making superficial kind of judgments about it. And those superficial judgments, ironically, they would be, the risk here would that it would be tantamount to just saying, oh, they're not addressing the primary contradiction, right? Like Deng and Xi are wrong because they don't address the primary contradiction. But wait, what did Mao say about the primary contradiction?
Yeah,
because he said that's something you work toward, right? It's not something you're just there. Now, I'm not saying he always lived up to that, right? But we find it in his thought, don't we? Right. So, is it a betrayal of Maoism or return to Maoism? There's an interesting question, right? They're very, very complex. So should we maybe move toward wrapping up now? Do you have anything you want to say, Ernesto?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to wrap up, I actually have a great quote for wrapping up.
Okay, sure. Yeah, give us a quote. We'll close up.
Yeah. Okay, so Mao is going into the historical development of communism, right, on a worldwide scale when he gives this thought. He says, the struggle of the proletariat and the revolutionary people to change the world comprises the fulfillment of the following tasks: to change the objective world and at the same time their own subjective world, to change their cognitive ability and change the relations between the subjective and the objective world. Such change, I'm going to skip that part because he praises the Soviet Union. Let's not get cancelled again. The people are pushing forward this process of change. The people of China and the rest of the world either are going through or will go through such a process. And the objective world, which is to be changed, also includes all the opponents of change, who, in order to be changed, must go through a stage of compulsion before they can enter the stage of voluntary conscious change. The epoch of world communism will be reached when all mankind voluntarily and consciously changes itself and the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and isn't that the case, right? Because it's like you can't just, the falsification of, liberal Democrats like to talk as if like, you just let people choose, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, but if you actually look at how sort of, liberal societies, republics were founded, right? It's like, it
was by force.
Yeah, it was.
People didn't choose.
Yeah, it's like you look at the American Revolution. It's like, do you agree with the American Revolution if you don't get the fuck out?
Right. Yeah. The people were conscribed to it. Yeah. Right.
What about
Same thing happened here in Mexico.
Yeah. What about Robespierre? Right. Similar kind of thing. So it's like, if you look at, when liberal Democrats, say to socialists that you have no right to use this kind of force, and often to societies that are going through, are in a similar stage of development as, Western societies were at an earlier point, right? When they say you have no right to use force, right? The reason they're saying that is because, they know that the use of force is effective, right? And that they don't want, socialism to succeed and to consolidate, a society successfully in the same way that they were able to, accomplish earlier with their own kind of bourgeois ideologies.
Of course, right? Yeah.
So it's like, and this is the thing. I think I always give the example, right? Like, in, Derrida talks about this. Like in Algeria, in the 90s, they had an election, and the people were going to vote for like an Islamist party that was anti-democracy. So they canceled the election to save democracy. And this is what I mean. It's democracy isn't just there. Like,
democracy must be protected.
Yeah, you have to create the conditions of democracy, right? Democracy must be protected. Socialism must be protected. So, and we shouldn't be naive, right? If everything's running really, really well, right, as it is in certain Western countries, right? Well, maybe not today, but, in general, then you don't need to resort to a high level of compulsion and force, right? But, whenever in China has it been running as well as, the France of 2015 or something like that. They've literally never, been in a situation that's that positive on the whole.
Something strange happened to me. So when I read this, English isn't my first language, right? So when I read compulsion, now that you're saying it again, I understand that it's by force, right? Yeah. But I actually gave it, since my actual exposure to English is through theoretical psychoanalytical texts sometimes. I was thinking of like an unconscious compulsion, right?
Yeah.
It seemed very Hegelian when I was reading it, and I thought, damn, like this. I used the blue highlight for like the dialectical highlight, and I see it's talking about another kind of compulsion. But if you read it in the Freudian sense, it makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and you can argue that Althusser sort of uses this kind of Freudian kind of approach to ideology, right? But it's like, I think like there's been a lot of, in Western Marxism, there's been a lot of attempts to analogize ideology to certain Freudian aspects in the way that you have this kind of source of tension, right, or cognitive dissonance that is then kind of pathologized, right, or becomes like neurotically sort of displaced, right? And there's been a lot of comparisons between that as well and kind of the functioning of ideology, right? So you can say, in a certain way, I think you can say, right, that building a movement is also a matter, if we're looking at contradictions, is also a matter of retrieving the unconscious compulsion.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's no coincidence that Zizek's doing the introduction, right?
Yeah. Well, it's not a coincidence for a few reasons. Should we wrap this up then?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Again, these ones are not as long as some of the things we've done in the past, but these are fairly, succinct, kind of short little essays. So, so that was on practice and on contradiction. I hope you guys felt like maybe you learned something from that. I did. But for the next week, we'll be reading. Let's see here. For the next week, we'll be reading. Let's read we're going to read 5 essays for next week because these are very short. These are just little speeches or whatever.
Yeah, one's like 1 page long.
Yeah. So we'll read so this is the Verso-published on Practice and Contradiction, which includes an introduction by Slavoj Žižek. So for next week, we'll be reading Combat Liberalism, number 5. 6, The Chinese People Cannot Be Cowed by the Atom Bomb. I do love that one. 7, U.S. Imperialism is a Paper Tiger. 8, Concerning Stalin's Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. And 9, Critique of Stalin's Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. So I think next week we'll be getting a little bit into the high Maoist, the essays he sort of wrote, when he was kind of jockeying to position himself as the world leader of revolution, right, in the Khrushchev era and so forth. So that'll take us into a whole other interesting kind of paradigm, right? Okay, guys, thank you so much. This has been a Zero Books Capital Comrades broadcast going out to a number of other groups. If you want to join our group, just search Zero Books Capital Comrades on Facebook with 2 Ks, Capital with a K and Comrades with a K. And otherwise, we will be back next week on Sunday at 2 p.m. EST, and we will be going through those 5 essays in the course of about an hour and 15 minutes. And this has been Conrad Hamilton and Ernesto Vargas. Catch you guys on the other side.
Bye.